Greetings, programs. Welcome to episode 38. What the hell is socialism anyway? So, we have another sort of economical episode today. Not really political, but it sort of is, because it has become so in most countries, especially in the US, where we hear about, but socialism killed 400 billion people with Stalin's eye lasers and other such like things constantly. But what even is socialism? I've mentioned it in passing a couple of times, assuming that everybody knew. But after a few "but Venezuela" comments, it seems that, like creationists arguing about evolution, no one who actually objects to socialism actually knows what it is. And so we're going to go over it in a little bit of detail, with particular attention to Bernie Sanders and Venezuela. So, what is socialism? Well, there is no one such thing as socialism, much like capitalism. In every country it's different, because people take the basic concept in words and use them in different ways. Socialism, as an overview of a concept, is the socialized ownership of the means of production. Means of production being factories, farms, mines, and businesses that actually produce the stuff that has value. So, not banks. This socialized ownership can be considered to be when the state owns the things, such as in the Soviet Union and much of China. This was called state capitalism by Lenin, one of the founders of the Soviet Union. He considered it a necessary first step. Then comes socialism, then communism. And later he changed his views. What's that? State capitalism? What is that? Well, like every other economic model, such as slavery or feudalism, there are state versions and private versions. The rich slave owners had slaves, and the king had slaves. Serfs worked for lords, and serfs worked for the king. Private slavery, state slavery. Private feudalism, state feudalism. Capitalism works the same way. There's state capitalism and there's private capitalism. First, we need to detail what capitalism even is. Now, a lot of times, people promoting capitalism will tell you all about free markets and such. And they'll say, but free markets are capitalism. No. Capitalism likes the market and needs the market, much in the same way as a cow likes and needs grass. But grass is not a cow, and the free market is not capitalism. No. Markets existed in feudal societies long before capitalism, and in slave-based societies even before that, before capitalism had even been thought of. It's in the Bible. Capitalism is like 400 years old. See footnote number 1 for historic details about the start of capitalism. Now, a capitalist economy and society is one in which those means of production that we mentioned are owned by private, non-state individuals. They make the decisions and set the rules and the pay. Not lords, not masters, just private individuals. And often, like air, we just take it for granted that this is the way it is to be. But, given the long history of the human race, capitalism is relatively recent. So that's capitalism. Your right to own the means of production exclusively and do with it whatever you want with it. If the factory owner decides one day they've just had enough and they're getting out of the business, they can just send everybody home and close the doors. That's ownership. Not free trade, not markets, just that, and the things that come from it. Which brings us back to socialism. Socialism is when the means of production are socialized, owned by society as a whole. Now, this can take several forms. It can either be because the means of production is owned by the workers, in which case it's called democratic socialism, or sometimes pure socialism, or sometimes direct socialism. This can also be when the state owns the means of production, and the people have control over the state. So, in a democracy, if the state owns the railways, and you can vote for things for the government to do, then it's a form of socialism, in that same way that a representative republic is not a direct democracy, but is still a form of democracy. I'd say the important distinction between state capitalism and this indirect form of socialism is whether the people have any control over the state. If the people tell the state to do something with ballots or whatever, and the state does it, then it's a form of indirect socialism. And if the state ignores them, as seems to be the case in China, then it's state capitalism. That's where the state acts like a capitalist. They own the means of production, set the rules, tell everybody what to do, just like a regular capitalist enterprise. They might or might not pay attention to what the workers want. But in the end, if the people want X and the state does Y, and you just have to suck it up, then it's not democracy and it's not socialism. So, why does this matter? Well, that brings us on to Venezuela and the Nordic countries. This is what causes the confusion when people who are pro-capitalist point at Venezuela as proof that socialism has failed, and then point at Nordic countries like Sweden, Finland, Norway, Iceland and Denmark as not being socialist. Venezuela and the Nordic group are in approximately the same boat. Both sets of countries are socialist in that the state owns the means of production, either in whole or in part, such as oil production, food production, transportation, and so on. All of those countries are democratic, so that if the people send a message to the government, in theory, the government should change how they do things. And they are socialist, in that they have many strong social policies that are in line with socialist ideals, like free healthcare, free education, and so on. Now, those policies are not socialist in and of themselves, but they are policies that are almost universally done by socialist parties and socialist countries, and thus have come to be seen as socialist. And both of these sets of countries are not socialist, in that the private capitalist sector forms the majority of the country's GDP, and that workers do not own the means of production, and if the government makes a decision contrary to wishes of the people, often those people have no recourse except to vote the government out some years later. And it is this grey area that causes all the confusion. Because Venezuela and the Nordic countries, both groups, both sides, democratic. At least allegedly so. Both sides have a private sector and a public sector. Both sides have state ownership of the means of production, particularly in terms of oil. By whatever criteria you judge Venezuela to be socialist, including having a party in charge that is called a socialist party, you must also do the same for the Nordic countries, because they too have socialist parties. Some of them even have communist parties, although they are currently not in power. So, you have to tar both of them with the same brush. Often people assume that because Venezuela is having a hard time, it must be socialist, and these other ones, they're not having a hard time, so clearly they can't be socialist. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And while the Cold War may be over, the propaganda that was as omnipresent as the air during that time had its effect. We absorbed it, or our parents absorbed it, and it became the common knowledge. Socialism is bad. We all know that. It never works. We all know that. Communism and socialism are the same things. We all know that. Well, as it happens, we all know wrong. Socialism has, at its core, a focus on the common people. So unless you happen to be a very rich person, that's you. And very few people would call that inherently bad. What's that, imaginary interviewer? Look at Venezuela, look how bad it is. Socialism did that? No, it did not. In fact, the reality of the situation of many so-called failed socialist states is terrifyingly grim. The actuality is, almost all of those states were taken down by the kinds of thing that, if they happened to a Western country, would be an act of war. How would Great Britain react if it turned out that some other country crashed the democratic process, staged a coup, and installed a military dictatorship? Well, that's what happened to almost every one of those struggling socialist countries. See footnote number 2 for US interventionism. That's right, socialism did not die, it was killed. Yes, even the USSR's fall had American fingerprints on it. So, How can an economic system said to be a failure if it is destroyed by outside influences? This is one of the reasons that outside of the US and maybe the UK, the United States of America is considered to be an empire. No, not hyperbole, a literal empire in every sense of the word. See footnote number 3 for discussions and details about the United States being an empire. But we're getting off topic. Socialism in various forms does work. It works in the socialism light forms in Europe. In direct proportion to how socialist they are, the happier, fairer, and nicer they are. It has worked in many historic instances until those states were destroyed, also by outside forces. And it forces one to ask the question, if socialism always fails, why does the US keep killing it with war, coups, sanctions, and other forms of economic warfare? And for those who further think that any attempt at socialism turns a country into a third world hellhole, it is interesting to note that research will show you that those countries in the hellhole category almost universally turn to socialism in desperation. They are already on the back foot when they go socialist. And oddly, they usually either survive or start turning things around. Right up until somebody goes after them. Usually the US, especially in South America, but also the UK and corporations based in both countries. See footnote number 4 for details about the Monroe Doctrine. So, the evidence we have for socialist countries looks pretty good. They do so well that the US has to step in and put a stop to it. And if we are counting state ownership of the means of production in a democratic country that is responsible to voters, then socialism is doing just fine throughout most of Europe. It's pretty obvious, really. Just compare the top 10 happiest countries with the top 10 most socialist countries. For example, here are the happiest countries in the world by international rankings. Finland, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Sweden, New Zealand. And here are a list of the most socialist countries in the world. China, Denmark, Finland, the Netherlands, Canada, Sweden, Norway, Ireland, New Zealand, and Belgium. Did you notice anything? That's right, a few names popped up in both lists. In fact, most of the names were in both lists. And here's something. I hear it a lot from capitalist cheerleaders, that China became more capitalist and that's why it's better. But here's the thing. People from outside China, who live there for a length of time, have noticed that the more capitalist it becomes, the worse it gets. Probably not a coincidence. See footnote number 5 for an outside view of China. So that's capitalism. Private ownership of the means of production with no recourse from the workers. And that also includes state capitalism. State ownership of the means of production with no recourse from the workers. Also, socialism. Socialized ownership of the means of production with input from the workers in one form or another. Either by the workers directly owning the means of production in a direct way, like a worker co-op, or by democratic control over the state, which does the owning, like in most of the happier countries. But what about communism? Well, like the others, it has a few meanings. According to some, it's a form of socialism, but the distinction is, communists believe that the revolution to a socialist form of society must be violent, like the revolution that transitioned us from feudalism to capitalism. According to others, it's socialism plus. So after you've had socialism for a while and everything is all lovely and democratic, you dial back the role of the state until it vanishes, and then you have a classless, stateless society. Also with no money or private property, according to some. If you're wondering how this works in practice, consider going to work. At work, there will be some tools that you use every day, gear that is assigned to you, a desk or a locker that is yours, but you don't own it, and if it breaks, you get more from the company. Like that. With no artificial scarcity caused by capitalism, there would ideally be enough stuff to go around so that you can take what you need with no drama. And the end result of this is fully automated, luxury, gay space communism, aka Star Trek. Yes, that's right, the Federation and Star Trek are commies. No money at all, unless they are trading with other groups. Did you need some new gear? Did you feel like having some new clothes? Did you need some equipment for a particular task? And the Federation is democratic, and the government seems to have very little overt power or military. You can't have capitalism in a situation like that. And if you're wondering about all those dictators, well, I'll point out that you get dictators in a capitalist society as well. Any number of tin pot dictators and banana republics, and most of them are capitalist. There's nothing about socialism that leads to having a dictatorship. If that was the case, there would be significantly less or none of the dictatorships in a capitalist society, and all of the communist ones would be, well, yeah, very dictatorship style. Unfortunately, because people try for communism or socialism of other kinds, usually in direct response to some kind of terrible disaster or collapse in the economy, it takes a strong hand at the wheel to basically force everybody to go along with the new idea. It's rather radical, after all. What does that sound like? That's right, something like a dictatorship. Well, that's not too good. And the problem with dictatorships is often they don't want to give up the reins of power. And often, if there's a further revolution, it'll be replaced by another dictatorship. Because of the aforementioned reasons. All that drama, all that stress, strong hand at the wheel, blah-de-blah, oh crap, here we go again. And this is just one reason why the socialists are not convinced that communism is the way to go. That violent seizure of the reins of power? Yeah, I think we've kind of seen where that tends to go. So the hope for many, for socialists certainly, is that there can be a peaceful transition of power. Which takes us back to Bernie, because that's what he's doing. Yes, Bernie really is a socialist. No, nothing about socialism says you have to have a large or powerful state government. In fact, ideally, much of the socialism would be less of that. Bernie is a democratic socialist, or to put it in short forms, worker co-ops, where the workers own the factories, own the farm, own the business altogether. There's a boss, usually, leading things, and that boss is usually selected from the people who work there. Often it's rotated, and if the boss is doing great, good for the company, good for the boss. And if the boss is terrible or dictatorial, they get voted out. Just like in a democratic election. But ideally, hopefully a bit quicker than every 4 years. And that's why Bernie is a socialist. He not only wants to nationalise things like healthcare and infrastructure and what have you, which is sort of socialist in that indirect socialist kind of way, but in a democratic country, which the States is for the most part, the people there would have some kind of input, which the government would be forced to listen to, over the means of production. But you could argue that's not really socialism. Okay, fair enough, no worries. Bernie also wants for the board of directors of any company to have at least 45% workers on it. That's right, workers in charge, at least partially. Worker ownership of the means of production. That's socialism. Bernie's a socialist, and good for him. Socialism usually works. It usually works so well that it has to be killed. Now, if you're wondering why, well, I'm going to link you to a video here. Footnote number 6, Bad Mouse Productions, A Tale of Anarcho-Capitalism. This is an apocryphal tale of an island with two states on it. One of which is capitalist and one of which is socialist. In short, in the socialist half of the island, the workers get treated well. They get significant control over what it is that they do and how much they get paid. They don't get worked to death. The company does not get sent overseas and all the workers fired. They are doing great. And all the workers on the capitalist side of the island see this. They see that there are no billionaires ruling everything. They see that the workers there are substantially better treated than they are, and better paid, and have a much better work-life balance. And so, they leave, and they go over to the socialist side. So what's the capitalist side going to do? Well, they have two choices. They can either do what the other side are doing, which essentially makes them either socialists or so close to socialist they might as well be. They would have to look after the workers, they would have to give their workers autonomy, they would have to give their workers such a heavy say in things that the workers would stay. Functionally, socialism. Or they get the state to bring out the big stick. They stop the workers leaving, or they declare war on other groups, specifically the socialist side of things. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound a lot like the US's endless wars? Does that sound like the Monroe Doctrine fiddling in all those would-be socialist countries? I think so. Because if a country went socialist and wasn't attacked and didn't fall apart from some kind of disastrous accident, then people would notice it. They would start to wonder, hey, why isn't it like that here? Because sure, the rich are powerful, and they're somewhat in control. More or less, depending on which country you're in. But here's the thing, there aren't many of them, and there are very many of us. There's a reason we're the 99%. We're the poor, we're the working class, we're the middle class. We're everybody except the 1%. And if a country was to stand out as a beacon of, hey, this shit works, sooner or later people are going to start asking some very pointed questions of the people in charge. And there's a limit to what they can do with propaganda. And this, in addition to things like oil that the US wants, is why strongly capitalist countries like the US and the UK, they're not blameless either. They attack countries like this. That's why there was a Cold War. That's why there were countries going socialist or even communist, and the US was undermining them, staging coups and doing all that kind of Cold War stuff that makes for such good books. And you know what? The news corporations are capitalist enterprises. It's not in their interest, and certainly not in their owners' or donors' interests, to talk up a socialist country. So go figure. You'll only find nice things ever said about socialists, not on the mainstream media. So, that's all for today. That's what capitalism is. That's what socialism is. An overview. Look in the doobly-doo below. I'm going to include a stack of links. Not just the ones I've mentioned here, but ones more peripheral. Better descriptions of what socialism is by people who really know their shit. As in, specifically, the people that taught me. And a few other things. So like I said, look down below for more information. Bye for now.